The entire ballroom fell silent the moment the maid threw herself in front of the Duke. 1 second, the grand hall of Evermont Palace was alive with music, laughter, and the polished elegance of noble society celebrating the winter season beneath crystal chandeliers. The next, a silver ceremonial blade spun loose across the marble floor during a fencing exhibition, and before anyone else could even react, a young maid in a plain dark uniform stepped directly into its path with her arms spread wide, as if her body alone could shield the most powerful man in the room. The blade never touched either of them. It struck a pillar and clattered harmlessly to the ground. But that did not matter. What mattered was the look on Duke Adrian Evermont's face afterward. Because for the first time in years, the cold and unreadable Duke stared at someone as though the world around him had disappeared entirely. And what happened after that moment would leave the entire estate speechless. Clara Vale had worked at Evermont Palace for nearly 3 years without anyone truly noticing her. She moved quietly through the halls carrying trays, polishing silver, changing linens, and keeping her head lowered the way servants were expected to do in houses ruled by old nobility. She was not from a wealthy family, nor did she possess the beauty that turned heads at royal gatherings. What she did possess was a strange kind of calm strength that revealed itself in small, unnoticed ways. She stayed late when the kitchen staff became overwhelmed. She repaired torn curtains herself rather than reporting them. She memorized which elderly servants needed help climbing the eastern staircase during winter mornings. Most people overlooked her because Clara made herself easy to overlook. The Duke certainly had. Adrian Evermont was a man surrounded constantly by noise, expectation, and obligation. Every hour of his life belonged to someone else. Politicians demanding alliances, noble families arranging dinners, advisors discussing finances, guests seeking favor. By 32, he had become exactly what society required him to be: disciplined, composed, untouchable. The newspapers called him the Iron Duke because nothing ever seemed to disturb him. He rarely smiled, never lost his temper, never indulged gossip. Even during lavish celebrations like the annual Winter Gala, he moved through crowds with the same distant politeness, speaking when necessary and disappearing the moment duty allowed. That evening had been no different. Hundreds of guests filled the palace ballroom dressed in silk and jewels, while musicians performed from the upper balcony. The fencing demonstration had been arranged purely for entertainment, with young noblemen showing off ceremonial swordsmanship before the gathered aristocracy. Adrian barely watched. He stood near the elevated platform speaking with a foreign ambassador, while servants circulated with silver trays of champagne. Clara happened to be among them, carefully navigating through the crowded hall with lowered eyes. Then came the mistake. One of the noblemen performing grew overconfident during a flourish. Laughter rose from the crowd as he spun dramatically, but his grip slipped at the worst possible moment. The ceremonial saber flew free from his hand, skidding sharply across the polished marble directly toward the Duke's platform. Everything happened in less than a second. Gasps filled the room. Several guests stepped backward. One guard reached instinctively for his sidearm, even though there was no real threat. But the only person who moved toward the danger instead of away from it was Clara. She dropped the tray she was holding, sending crystal glasses crashing across the floor, and rushed directly between the Duke and the spinning blade without hesitation. Her arms lifted instinctively in front of him. Her eyes squeezed shut, and the entire ballroom froze. The saber struck the stone edge of the platform beside them instead of either person, then clattered harmlessly onto the marble floor below. Silence consumed the room so completely that the fading echo of the blade seemed deafening. Clara remained standing there for a moment, breathing unevenly, unaware that every noble in the ballroom was staring at her in disbelief. A maid had just thrown herself in front of a duke. Adrian looked down at her with an expression no one present could understand. He should have been irritated by the disruption, embarrassed by the spectacle. Instead, he seemed almost stunned. Slowly, Clara opened her eyes and realized neither of them had been hurt. Color rushed immediately into her face. She stepped backward so quickly she nearly stumbled over the edge of her skirt. "Your Grace, I'm sorry," she whispered breathlessly, horrified by what she had done. "I only thought." "You thought I was in danger," Adrian finished quietly. His voice carried through the silent ballroom with unnerving calm. The nobleman responsible for losing the blade rushed forward pale with panic, apologizing repeatedly, but the Duke barely acknowledged him. His attention never left Clara. For the first time since she had entered his household 3 years earlier, Adrian Evermont was truly looking at her. Not as part of the background. Not as another servant passing through the corridors. Looking at her as though trying to understand why someone with no obligation to protect him would react so fearlessly. Clara lowered her gaze immediately beneath the intensity of his attention. Every instinct told her she had crossed a line she could never uncross. Servants were not meant to draw attention during noble gatherings. They certainly were not meant to place themselves physically between a duke and danger, however accidental it may have been. Whispering spread rapidly through the ballroom. Some guests looked amused, others scandalized. Several older aristocrats exchanged disapproving glances, already imagining tomorrow's gossip. Yet Adrian seemed entirely unaffected by the murmuring around him. Without warning, he extended his hand toward Clara. The entire room appeared to stop breathing. "Walk with me," he said. Clara stared at his outstretched hand in complete confusion. A duke did not escort maids through royal gatherings. Such things simply did not happen. But Adrian waited patiently, his expression unreadable. Trembling slightly, Clara placed her hand in his. Another wave of whispers swept through the ballroom instantly. Then, to the shock of every guest present, the Duke of Evermont led a servant girl away from the Winter Gala himself. No explanation, no apology, no concern for the hundreds of eyes following them across the marble floor. The grand doors closed behind them, muting the music of the ballroom, and for the first time all evening, Adrian spoke without formality. "You were willing to be injured for someone you barely know," he said quietly as they entered the long, candlelit corridor beyond the hall. Clara looked down immediately. "You are my employer, Your Grace." "That is not an answer." She swallowed nervously, unsure why his voice suddenly sounded less like a duke addressing a servant and more like a man trying to understand something important. "I didn't think," she admitted softly. Adrian studied her for a long moment beneath the warm corridor lights. And somewhere deep inside him, something unfamiliar shifted for the very first time. For the next several days, the entire palace whispered about the maid who had stepped in front of the duke, but no one whispered more than the servants themselves, because servants understood better than anyone how dangerous attention could become inside noble houses. Clara felt it everywhere she went. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms. Footmen glanced at her with open curiosity. Even the older maids who had once treated her kindly now watched her carefully, as though afraid proximity to scandal might somehow stain them too. Clara wished desperately that the Winter Gala had never happened. She wanted the palace to return to normal, to long quiet days where no one noticed whether she crossed a corridor or entered a room. But normal became impossible the moment Duke Adrian Evermont began noticing her everywhere. It started subtly. One morning during breakfast service, he asked another servant where the girl from the ballroom was. The question alone stunned the dining staff into silence. Later that afternoon, Clara discovered fresh flowers had been delivered to the servant quarters after she mentioned in passing that winter made the halls feel lifeless. No card accompanied them, but everyone knew where they had come from. Then there were the conversations. Brief at first, unexpected. Adrian stopping beside her while she organized books in the library. Adrian asking whether her shoulder had healed after she struck the platform during the blade incident. Adrian pausing during evening walks through the palace gardens whenever he happened to see her trimming frost-damaged roses. Every interaction left Clara more unsettled than the last because the Duke did not speak to people without purpose. Yet around her, he seemed to forget entirely that he was supposed to remain distant. The strangest part was that Adrian himself did not fully understand what was happening. For years, his life had moved with mechanical precision. Meetings, responsibilities, formal dinners, endless conversations with people who measured every word for advantage. But Clara spoke differently. She never tried to impress him, never flattered him, never seemed aware that most people in the kingdom feared disappointing him. When he asked her opinion about the library renovations one rainy afternoon, she answered honestly that the darker wallpaper made the room feel cold and unfriendly. His advisors had praised the design for weeks. Clara simply frowned at it and said, "It feels lonely." Adrian found himself staring at her after that answer far longer than necessary, because somehow she had described exactly how the room made him feel too. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the gala, Adrian returned unexpectedly early from a political dinner and found the palace unusually quiet. Most servants had retired for the night, and the great hall stood empty beneath dim candlelight. As he passed the music room, he heard a piano playing softly behind the closed doors. The melody was gentle and slow, carrying through the corridor with a sadness so beautiful it stopped him mid-step. Adrian opened the door quietly. Clara sat alone at the grand piano near the windows, completely unaware anyone was listening. Her fingers moved carefully across the ivory keys while moonlight spilled across the room around her. Adrian had attended royal concerts performed by the finest musicians in Europe, yet somehow this felt more honest than any of them. Clara suddenly noticed him standing there and froze instantly. The music stopped. She stood up so quickly the piano bench nearly tipped backward. "Your Grace, I apologize," she said nervously. "I didn't realize anyone was awake." Adrian should have left. Instead, he walked farther into the room. "Why did you stop?" Clara blinked in surprise. "Because servants are not meant to use this room." "I asked why you stopped playing." She looked uncertain for a moment before answering softly. "No one has ever asked me to continue before." Something about those words affected him more than it should have. Adrian moved toward the piano slowly, his expression quieter than usual. "Then allow me to be the first." Clara hesitated before slowly sitting again. Her hands trembled slightly above the keys, but after a long moment, she began to play once more. Adrian remained standing beside the piano while the melody filled the room around them. Neither spoke, yet the silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt strangely peaceful, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Adrian realized he did not want the moment to end. Unfortunately, moments like that never remained hidden for long inside aristocratic society. Rumors spread beyond Evermont Palace with alarming speed. Noble women began arriving for sudden visits far more frequently than usual. Mothers with unmarried daughters suddenly discovered excuses to attend Adrian's dinners. Even members of the royal court began making subtle remarks about the importance of preserving proper appearances. Adrian ignored all of it at first. Clara could not. She noticed the way aristocratic women looked at her during gatherings now. Some seemed amused by her. Others pitied her. A few looked openly cruel. One afternoon, while arranging flowers in the western drawing room, Clara overheard 2 visiting ladies speaking nearby. "The Duke cannot possibly be serious," one woman laughed quietly. "A maid catching his attention after a dramatic accident is one thing, but infatuation fades quickly." "Of course it does," the other replied. "Men like the Duke marry for status, not affection." Clara kept arranging the flowers as though she had heard nothing at all, but the words settled painfully inside her chest because deep down, she feared they were true. That evening, Adrian found her unusually distant during supper preparations. She avoided meeting his eyes. Her answers became short and formal again. Finally, as she turned to leave the dining room, Adrian spoke firmly enough to stop her. "Clara." She paused near the doorway. "Have I done something to upset you?" The concern in his voice caught her completely off guard. Clara lowered her gaze immediately. "No, Your Grace. You are avoiding me." Silence stretched between them. Adrian stepped closer, though not enough to frighten her. "Tell me why." Clara's fingers tightened slightly around the serving tray in her hands. "Because people are talking. People always talk. Not like this." Adrian studied her expression carefully, then understood for the first time what this attention was costing her. The gossip that mildly irritated him could ruin someone in her position entirely. Yet even realizing that, he could not bring himself to step away from her. That frightened him more than anything. Clara finally lifted her eyes toward his, and Adrian felt his chest tighten unexpectedly at the sadness he found there. "You should not keep looking for me," she whispered. "Why?" The question came instantly. She hesitated before answering. "Because eventually you'll remember who I am." Adrian stared at her for several long seconds. Then, quietly, with a sincerity that made her breath catch, he said, "Clara, you are the first real thing I've seen in years." And in that moment, standing alone with the Duke beneath the soft golden light of the dining hall, Clara realized the danger was no longer gossip or scandal or noble whispers behind closed doors. The danger was that she was beginning to love him too. Snow covered the grounds of Evermont Palace by the time the royal winter season reached its final celebration, turning the enormous estate into something that looked almost unreal beneath thousands of lantern lights and frost-covered gardens. But inside the palace, warmth and music filled every corridor as nobles from across the country gathered for the grand closing ball hosted by Duke Adrian Evermont himself. To everyone watching, the evening appeared flawless. Crystal chandeliers glowed above endless lines of dancing aristocrats while musicians performed from the marble balcony, and servants moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays filled with champagne. Yet Adrian barely noticed any of it, because from the moment the evening began, he had searched every room for only one person. Clara had spent the last several weeks trying desperately to create distance between them after realizing her feelings for him had become impossible to control. She performed only the duties assigned to her. She avoided the library where they once spoke quietly for hours. She no longer played the piano after midnight. And whenever Adrian entered a room unexpectedly, she found reasons to leave almost immediately. None of it worked. If anything, the distance only made Adrian more certain that what he felt for her was real. He had spent years surrounded by beautiful noble women who knew exactly how to charm powerful men, yet none of them had ever affected him the way Clara did, simply by speaking honestly or looking at him without calculation. Still, he understood the impossible reality standing between them. A duke did not choose a maid. Not in noble society. Not under the constant judgment of aristocrats who valued status above happiness. Advisors had already begun pressuring him openly about marriage alliances. Newspapers speculated weekly about which wealthy family he would join through courtship. And despite everything he felt, Adrian knew Clara carried the heavier burden, because scandal for him meant gossip, while scandal for her could destroy her future entirely. That night, Clara tried to remain invisible among the serving staff during the grand ball. But invisibility became impossible the moment Adrian entered the ballroom and immediately found her in the crowd. Their eyes met for only a second across the enormous hall, yet it was enough for several observant nobles nearby to notice. Whispering spread almost instantly. Clara looked away at once and disappeared deeper into the crowd, her pulse racing painfully in her chest. An hour later, while delivering wine to one of the private upper lounges, Clara accidentally overheard a conversation that stopped her cold outside the doorway. Several aristocratic women stood inside speaking openly, clearly assuming no servants were nearby. "The Duke has embarrassed himself long enough," one woman said sharply. "Everyone sees it now." Another laughed softly. "Infatuation makes men foolish. He'll come to his senses eventually." And the girl, a servant, should know better than to mistake attention for affection. Clara stood motionless in the corridor as humiliation spread through her chest like ice. She knew she should walk away immediately, but hearing the words aloud somehow shattered the fragile hope she had tried so hard not to nurture. Because deep down, she had started believing Adrian truly cared for her. Worse, she cared for him enough that seeing his reputation damaged on her behalf suddenly felt unbearable. That night, while the palace still celebrated below, Clara made her decision. By morning, she would leave Evermont Palace forever. Before sunrise, the estate remained quiet beneath falling snow. Most guests still slept after the ball, and servants had only begun lighting the morning fires when Clara quietly carried her small suitcase through the servant corridors one final time. She paused only once outside the music room where Adrian had first listened to her play piano. For a brief moment, she nearly lost the resolve to continue. Then she forced herself forward. Better to leave now, before her feelings destroyed both of them. She reached the palace gates just as the first pale light of dawn touched the snow-covered grounds. But before she could step onto the road beyond the estate, the sound of approaching carriage wheels broke the silence behind her. Clara turned slowly. Adrian stepped out of the black carriage before it had even fully stopped moving. He was still wearing the formal black coat from the previous evening, as though he had never gone to bed at all. Snow dusted his dark hair, while exhaustion shadowed his face. But none of that hid the intensity in his eyes when he looked at her standing there with a suitcase in her hand. "You were leaving without saying goodbye." Clara lowered her gaze immediately because hearing the hurt beneath his calm voice nearly broke her resolve. "It's better this way, Your Grace." Adrian walked toward her slowly through the snow. For whom? For you. He stopped only a few feet away. You don't get to decide that alone. Clara's eyes filled despite every effort to remain composed. People are laughing at you because of me. I don't care. But I do. Her voice cracked softly for the first time. You are a duke, Adrian. It was the first time she had ever spoken his name aloud, and both of them felt the significance of it instantly. You belong to a world I was never meant to stand inside. Adrian stared at her for several long seconds before speaking again, quieter now. The night of the Winter Gala, he said slowly. When that blade came toward me, every person in that ballroom stepped back. Clara swallowed hard. I wasn't thinking. Exactly. He moved closer. You acted because your first instinct was to protect someone else. His expression softened in a way she had never seen before. Do you have any idea how rare that is in my world? Tears slipped silently down Clara's cheeks. Adrian reached for her hand carefully, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. For years, he continued softly. People have wanted my title, my influence, my name. You were the first person who cared whether I was safe. Clara looked up at him then, completely defenseless beneath the honesty in his voice. And somewhere after that moment, Adrian admitted quietly, you became the first person I could not stop thinking about. The snow fell gently around them in the silence that followed. Then Clara whispered the question that had terrified her for weeks. What happens now? Adrian smiled faintly for the first time in years, the expression so genuine it almost transformed him entirely. Now, he said, intertwining his fingers with hers, I stopped pretending I want a life without you in it. Later that morning, when the Duke of Evermont walked back into the palace holding a maid's hand openly before the entire household, the reaction was immediate. Servants froze mid-step. Noble guests standing in the entrance hall fell completely silent. Even Adrian's advisors looked stunned beyond words. But Adrian never loosened his hold on Clara's hand for even a second. Because at some point between the falling blade, the quiet conversations, the midnight piano melodies, and the girl who always placed others before herself, the cold and untouchable Duke of Evermont had fallen hopelessly in love. And judging by the way Clara looked back at him that morning beneath the soft winter light pouring through the palace windows, everyone realized that exactly the same moment that she had fallen in love with him too.